A quick question for Mark and one comment. First of all, I mean, next time we need to talk about one of our papers. I mean, you can call me. You know, in half an hour we can wrap it up. We don't have to, you know, spend 3 hours with Jeff on the phone. That would be easier. That's what I was suspecting. He gave it a shampoo line, probably. So the one comment, I would probably add a point number 11 there on one of the sort of the last slides, and it would be something along the lines of the role of earnings, the reported earnings, and something called like the attribution issue that I think is happening. And I think in this literature, an underappreciated fact or notion is the role of the earnings that are reported by management on the distributions, on the properties that we find in the forecast area, okay? And they can actually explain a lot of what's happening in this particular literature. One thing that would be helpful, I think, going forward is if studies that look at forecast error, you know, before they immediately jump and attribute any correlation, coefficient, association to the analyst. Okay, we got to keep in mind there's forecast and earnings happening in there. So just spend a little bit of time thinking, you know, if what you observe as the correlation, as the regression coefficient, or whatever have you, is generated or should be attributed to an analyst behavior, or it all comes from earnings. Actually, you can get a lot of mileage by just looking at the earnings and forget a little bit about the forecast, and I think that will lead to a lot of progress here. The other sort of a quick question for you, just if you have any thoughts. You had a slide there talking about optimism in analyst earnings forecast, and I think that the line was there, first of all, you said, I think we have to ask ourselves what forecasts are optimistically biased. And I would actually go back, and before I asked that, I would say, you know, why are analyst forecasts, or what incentives analysts have to optimistically bias their earnings forecast? And if you think about it, it's not necessarily that trivial, because, you know, if you talk to analysts, they're saying that, you know, the last thing they want to do is to upset management and optimistically bias their earnings forecast, thereby making it so much harder for them to meet them. And the firm is risking just getting penalized horrendously, you know, by a torpedo earnings effect or whatever have you there. So it's not clear why would they have an incentive to optimistically bias their earnings forecast, you know, not recommendation and target price. So, you know, I would just stop and think a little bit before. I know it's sort of commonly believed that the Curry favor, you know, hypothesis that is happening there, but just stop and think in a particular scenario if they do have an incentive to optimistically bias their forecast. And I just wonder if you have any sort of thoughts on the why question. Why would they do that?
Do I have any thoughts? Yes. But you mentioned two things. So one is your emphasis that when we look at forecast errors, any attribution we make based on an analysis of forecast errors is usually attached to the analyst, rather than looking at the actual earnings. And I think you're exactly right there. And I know you and Jeff have another paper looking at that. And this was the issue where I mentioned 1992. Something happened in at least the codifying of what earnings are on the data we use in 1992. But you know, there was a recent paper, I forget who it's by, where they looked at footnote codes on the first call database, where the first call for a small number of analyst forecasts specifically identifies non-recurring or special items that are excluded from the analyst forecast and those that are included. And what they found was consistent with analysts being more cognizant of earnings items that are tending to recur, and when they did, they would include them in their forecast, and those that were more transitory they would exclude. And so this is getting, I think, towards the flavor of what you're talking about, of considering the earnings forecasts, the earnings in addition to just the forecast data. The second thing you said is, you know, questioning why would analysts actually want to be optimistic in the first place. Yeah, that's something that hit me when I first read the Francis and Philbrick paper that conditioned supposed incentives for analysts to be optimistic in their earnings forecasts based on a timeliness ranking prepared by Value Line that they're not responsible for. So it was always confusing to me. It was a paradox why analysts might want to set this high hurdle for managers that they're unlikely or maybe less likely to hit. So I agree that's a paradox, and keeping in mind the incentives of what analysts do is sort of where the research has come to at this point. And the reason it wasn't mentioned early in the slides because it sort of happened later in the literature. And I guess that's where a lot of the focus in the current working papers is on analyst incentives. And particularly this work by Gu and Wu and Basu and Markov on analyst loss functions, right? So the loss function presumably would be related to any incentive an analyst would have to be biased.
Mark, you did a wonderful job. I thought you did a great job. I'd like to commend you on that.
Uh-oh.
I'd like to make a few comments, perhaps, to elucidate some of the points that you were making.
And I'll clarify, if I were to restate what Brown and Roseff found, I would switch it a little bit, what I said on the long-term forecast. So if you're, it implied, let me go ahead and say, I implied that Brown and Roseff said that analysts that time series models were better than analysts at the long term. That was opposite. So when you think about when you present and you say something you wish you could redo, that was one of them. But anyway, the analysts are better than time series models at long term. But anyway,
1990.
that was a filibuster, by the way, to keep.
1992. Prior to about 1990, 1991, you had two players. You had Ibis and Zax, and they were very weak players. It was said that if Zax knew what he was doing, he would have eaten Ibis's lunch. But fortunately for Ibis, he did not. But then First Call came on the scene in the early 90s, and they were backed by, 8 or 10 of the large brokerage houses, and they were the first call, meaning that the analysts were giving the information, these big analysts of the big houses were giving the information to First Call first before they were giving them to Ibis or anyone else. And that really got Ibis to get their act together. And prior to 92, they didn't really care that much about their actuals. I mean, they were primarily in the business of generating forecasts. And I think, that helps explain what went on around 92. And I'd recommend that for people using IBIS data, they don't use the pre-92 data.
The pre-92 actuals.
Yes, in fact, interestingly, we act as if and with good reason, as Jeff and Reuven have pointed out, that there's all kinds of problems with the IBIS actuals. However, what we forget is that there's tremendous problems with the CompuStat actuals. And when I talk to quantitative money managers, and maybe we'll learn more at the late session today from them, I've heard them say, well, we subscribe to Zax actuals because the CompuStat actuals are garbage. And we like the analyst actuals. Okay, that's one point. The other point, second point is BGHZ, as did Frieden Gavoli, referred to a timing advantage and an information advantage, as you pointed out. However, what you've also alluded to, excuse me, there's really a third advantage. And you were alluding to this. The third advantage is that the analysts communicate with the managers, and the managers create the numbers. So you not only have managers telling analysts what the numbers are going to look like, but the managers have the sort of the last word in creating the numbers themselves. And this is what makes, let's say, analysts' forecasts different than forecasts of inflation targets or treasury bill rates or what have you. And I think we need to understand that. Third point is regarding Francis and Philbrick. Similar to yourself, I was puzzled for many years by their story as to why it is that, how it is that managers are somehow going to be happy when a firm puts out a sell recommendation that they're being placated in some way by optimistic earnings forecasts. Somehow this didn't make a lot of sense to me. And one day I was at a professional conference of professionals, and they said something that made a lot of sense, and that is the reason that analysts are, let's say, overly optimistic in their earnings forecasts when they have sell recommendations is so they can say to their clients, see, I told you, sell that stock, they missed their forecasts again. They were, they basically came in below my expectation. So they do it to facilitate their recommendations, not to please managers. And finally, the II results that earnings forecasts are not all that important. I think we have to think about that in perhaps a different, I agree with that in that context, but as Rick was saying, there's really another context in which to think, and that is how do money managers, what do they rely on? And it used to be, Peter Bernstein put out this survey at Merrill Lynch. I'm not sure if it still goes out every year, but the last I knew, earnings revisions and earnings surprises were at the top of the list. So that's what the quants are looking at, and as we know, the post-earnings announcement drift stuff has been going on for years, and although Rick didn't mention it, he alluded to in some sense his recent paper in JAR with Joshua Livnat, which talks about post-earnings announcement drift and how one can profit most by using both analyst forecasts, extreme SUs, and time series models. So
I thank you for mentioning it, Larry.
oh, you owe me. You
just forgot.
You can thank me. I'll give you my electronic checking account number. And talk is cheap. Thank you.
And so let me just one comment. I can just remember the last thing you said, but about the notion of quants placing earnings surprises, high on their list of things that are important, and that being in conflict with that evidence. Yeah, I totally agree. When I actually did a content analysis of a bunch of analyst reports where I read how they justified their recommendations, the number 2 thing that showed up on my analysis was expected earnings surprise. So analysts will often upgrade a stock because they anticipate the current consensus will be wrong, sort of, in whichever direction. So if they upgrade, the consensus is likely to be too low at the current point. So the forecast revision activity is clearly of utmost importance.
So I'm going to keep most of my comments on the analysts to the panel later, but I have one observation and one question. The observation is when you think about the incentives, the one thing no one mentioned, but my experience suggests is probably the biggest issue, is your clients are primarily buy-side analysts, at least historically. And therefore, you have to be extremely cautious as a sell-side analyst, which is really the universe you're all looking at, how you reflect on your clients' let's say accuracy or quality of what they're doing. So particularly when you think about a negative call where essentially the buy-side analyst should have been aware or arguably will be asked why they weren't coming up with that same conclusion. And negative outcomes are much more of concern in many cases to the portfolio managers than a slightly understated upside. You are basically destroying or hurting your clients by making those kinds of calls. Mm-hmm. So that's an incentive that I would never underestimate in terms of how these things play out. That's the observation. The question is, when Jeff talked yesterday, he talked about pedagogy and the practice of accounting. And it relates a little bit to Pat's point. Do you see, and I guess this is for almost anyone in this audience, but you, do you see that there is a way that academic researchers can actually evaluate the extent to which accounting plays? Can you use analyst research to actually talk about accounting? I mean, I'm going to try and show you that it actually does matter, but I'm not sure in a research context this focus on just the earnings and the quarterly earnings doesn't necessarily tell us that much, at least in my view, about accounting. So how would you actually play this out to the regulators or the pedagogy of accounting? And is there a future way to that? You know, Pat sort of posed that as a question, but can you actually see a way you could actually do it for those people who want to carry on doing this kind of research?
I just have to say that's difficult. I mean, Jeff alluded to this yesterday about the, I don't know how he said it, but the shameless dance we do in class with our students, where I'm okay going in and talking about evidence in the literature that's consistent, it's at least consistent in an indirect fashion with analysts responding to accounting changes or various accounting items. And I have no problem telling the students that they do, even though the research and the methods we use end up with conclusions that analysts may get it a little bit, but not fully. It's sort of the pessimistic view is in our research, but in class, I'm more optimistic in my interpretation. I don't know if that got exactly to your point, but I wanted to save time for my colleagues up here.
I may be the least qualified person in the room to answer that question. I don't teach accounting, so I'll keep my mouth shut.
But I think what you raise is a difficult question, right? And it's one that's I don't think has been sufficiently answered.
But part of the issue, I think, is that I understand it's a data problem to the point, but you know the focus on the single metric, which actually is a summary metric of a lot of other things. There may be ways that creative people in this room can start thinking about it that way, because actually I think that's where we'll add a lot of value to what people like Ramu do every day, but also to what we do in the classroom, how we influence the practice and so on. So I think there is an opportunity there to go beyond that, and maybe you could get Larry to influence some of the suppliers of the data to ask for a few more lines in the financial statements. Because analysts, one of the observations I will make, although I want to keep it for later, is when you talked about sort of earnings accuracy at the bottom and stock selection, frankly, stock selection shouldn't matter at all. If you already know how to do stock selection, go to the buy side, don't stay on the sell side. But what went up in the rankings were financial models. Well, that means you've got lots of items that are being forecasted even if it's one period. So maybe that's something where we could go a little bit deeper if the aggregators of this data started paying a little more attention.
So can I try and address the first question of what we can do? I'm not going to give a research design, but I think that if we consider the earnings forecast as just being a forecast, thank you. If the earnings forecast is just going to be a forecast of what's on the bottom line next period, then it's not going to really help us get at those questions of what information are they using and how are they using it and so forth, not in a very realistic or helpful way. So I think that we really do need to expand the things we're looking at beyond the earnings forecast to get at questions of, content analysis would be one way to see whether analysts are using and understand accounting. But I think at least as important as that is whether they need to, whether that's important to the real decisions of stock picking and so forth. And so I would take earnings forecasts out of that picture. I wouldn't want them to look at earnings forecasts. I would want to look at their reports and when do the relationships between their earnings forecasts and their recommendations change? Is it actually because they're incorporating these other variables?
I know we're breaking for a break, but let me challenge you a little bit all on that. How about looking at whether maybe what they do on pensions or how the pensions actually affects the forecast accuracy, of course, including the actual number as well. But there's something where you can actually relate it because it's something that the regulators are dealing with right now, etc. And pensions happens to be a little pet of mine, but there are ways, I think, that you can use the issues in accounting that do actually make predictability of earnings or forecasting of earnings extremely difficult. That would be something where people in this room have a comparative advantage, not Rick because he's not an accountant, but where we have a comparative advantage to actually help people think this through. Because if you look at what the regulators say, that is one of their intentions, right? To help people forecast X, whatever X may be.